2 in the morning. The Arabian Sea, 300 miles southeast of the coast of Oman. The destroyer, USS Mason, was already at battle stations, its steel hull vibrating with the low-frequency hum of a ship prepared for immediate violence. The crew had not slept in 19 hours, their faces illuminated by the pale blue and amber glow of the multifunction displays in the Combat Information Center. 40 miles to the north, something was moving across the radar screens that defied the patterns of normal commercial traffic or regional exercise. The air over the water was heavy, thick with the smell of salt and the metallic tang of ozone from the ship's massive radar arrays. Below the waterline, the sonar operator felt the rhythmic thrum of the 4 gas turbine engines pushing the 10,000-ton vessel through a light 2-meter swell. The mission had begun as a standard escort for a high-value merchant convoy, but the intelligence reports over the last 6 hours had turned the routine into a high-stakes defensive operation. Something had changed in the Iranian tactical posture since the previous midnight. Usually, the reconnaissance drones from the mainland flew in pairs, keeping a respectful distance of at least 15 miles from United States Navy assets. Tonight, the signature was different. It was wide, flickering, and growing in intensity. It was not a pair of aircraft. It was a swarm, a coordinated mass of nearly 40 low-cost, high-endurance platforms flying in a tight, aggressive formation. In the center of the darkened ship, the commanding officer watched the Aegis display with a practiced, steady gaze. The unanswered question hung in the air. Were these drones merely observers, or were they the forward edge of a saturation strike designed to overwhelm the ship's defenses? The thermal humidity of the Arabian Sea pressed against the exterior of the superstructure, while inside, the air conditioning worked at maximum capacity to keep the sensitive computers from overheating. Every sailor in the compartment knew that the next 10 minutes would define the success of their deployment. The radar contacts continued to close. The distance. They were flying at an altitude of 3,000 meters, maintaining a speed of 180 kilometers per hour. There was no radio communication from the approaching formation. There were no transponder signals. On the tactical map, the green icons representing the drones began to flash red as they crossed the first of 3 defensive triggers. The environment outside was a wall of blackness, the stars obscured by a high layer of haze, leaving the crew to rely entirely on the digital world projected on their screens. The executive officer leaned over the tactical sea hut, his voice low and professional. He noted that the swarm was beginning to fan out, attempting to encircle the destroyer from the north and the northeast simultaneously. This was a sophisticated maneuver, one that required high-bandwidth control or advanced autonomous programming. The USS Mason was now the center of a closing circle. The tactical supervisor reported that the target illumination radars were already locked onto the lead elements of the swarm. A single bead of sweat ran down the neck of the fire control technician. He held his hand over the console, waiting for the final authorization. The ship was a silent predator in the dark, its lights extinguished, its presence marked only by the massive electronic signature it projected into the void. The Arabian Sea remained calm, the surface like black glass, reflecting nothing of the tension growing within the steel walls of the American destroyer. The distance to the lead drone was now 28 miles. The time for observation was ending. The time for engagement was seconds away. 2:15 in the morning. The Arabian Sea, latitude 21 degrees north, longitude 62 degrees east. The USS Mason continued its steady transit, but the atmosphere inside the Combat Information Center had shifted from high-alert observation to the grim preparation for an active engagement. The air in the compartment was chilled to 18 degrees Celsius to protect the massive processors of the Aegis combat system. Yet the scent of recycled air and stale coffee remained thick. The cloud of electronic noise had finally resolved into 40 distinct, individual tracks. The AN/SPY-6 radar, the most advanced eyes of the United States Navy, was now pumping megawatts of energy into the night sky, slicing through the salt haze, to paint a perfect digital picture of the approaching threat. The classification subsystem confirmed the worst-case scenario. These were not the small, improvised quadcopters used by regional militias, but rather the Iranian-produced Shahed-136 delta-wing loitering munitions. Each platform was roughly 3 meters long, powered by a 4-cylinder piston engine that produced a distinctive, lawnmower-like drone that would be audible for miles if not for the crashing of the waves against the destroyer's hull. More importantly, each drone was packed with 40 kilograms of high explosives and an optical seeker designed to lock onto the largest thermal signature in its path. The swarm was now flying in a staggered, multi-layered formation at an altitude of 2,500 meters, maintaining a steady cruise speed of 185 kilometers per hour. The commanding officer watched as the green icons on his screen flickered, then turned a steady, aggressive red. The drones were no longer just flying a search pattern. They had begun to execute a pre-programmed attack profile. The swarm split into 3 distinct cells. One group maintained its high-altitude approach toward the surface of the water, leveling off at a height of only 15 meters. This sea-skimming maneuver was a deliberate attempt to exploit the radar horizon and the clutter of the wave tops, a tactic designed to confuse older defensive systems. But the USS Mason was a product of a different era of warfare, and its sensors tracked the descending targets with cold, mathematical precision. The tactical action officer reported that the drones had crossed the 20-mile exclusion line, a boundary the United States Navy had established as the final threshold for defensive action. The provocation was no longer theoretical. By dropping to sea-skimming altitudes and accelerating toward the merchant convoy, trailing 3 miles behind the destroyer, the Iranian swarm had committed to a hostile act. The environment outside was a wall of absolute darkness, the moon obscured by a thick layer of Arabian dust and sea mist. But inside the Combat Information Center, the battle was being fought in a world of high-resolution vectors and intercept probabilities. The electronic warfare suite, known as the SLQ-32, began to detect active seeker pings from the lead drones. The machines were hunting. The technician at the electronic warfare console reported that the drones were attempting to frequency hop, searching for a gap in the ship's jamming umbrella. The ship's hull groaned as the helmsman executed a 5-degree rudder adjustment to keep the primary radar arrays oriented toward the largest concentration of threats. The smell of ozone from the high-voltage equipment grew sharper, a physical reminder of the sheer amount of energy being harnessed to defend the ship and its charges. Each sailor at their station felt the weight of the moment. The technical data flowing across the screens was a clear narrative of an impending strike. The drones were now 17 miles away, a distance that a missile would cover in less than 30 seconds. The deliberate nature of the swarm's flight path, weaving to avoid projected intercept points and splitting to saturate multiple axes of defense, proved that this was a coordinated military operation. The verification was complete. The targets were identified, the hostile intent was proven by their flight profile, and the defensive triggers had been tripped. The commanding officer leaned toward the internal communications handset. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the product of decades of training for this exact sequence of events. He gave the order to transition to the next phase of the engagement. The ship's computer systems shifted into an active fire control mode, allocating specific interceptors to each of the 40 incoming targets. The silence of the night was about to be shattered by the sound of 21st century combat. 2:20 in the morning. The Arabian Sea and the hardened command center of the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. The communication between the USS Mason and the regional headquarters was instantaneous, carried by a secure satellite link that bypassed the atmospheric interference of the humid Gulf air. In the destroyer's Combat Information Center, the commanding officer listened to the digitized voice of the theater commander, confirming the transition to active defense. The rules of engagement were clear and absolute. Under the inherent right of self-defense and the mandate to protect the merchant vessels of the convoy, the United States Navy was now authorized to use lethal force to neutralize the encroaching aerial threat. The atmosphere on the ship tightened, but there was no panic, only the practiced efficiency of a crew that had rehearsed this scenario hundreds of times in simulators. The ship's internal temperature remained a steady 18 degrees Celsius, but near the electronics racks, the air felt charged with the heat of thousands of circuits processing millions of calculations per second. Outside, the Arabian Sea was a black void, the salt spray from the 2-meter swells coating the forward deck in a thin, slippery film that smelled of the deep ocean and cold iron. The destroyer was no longer just a vessel, it was an integrated weapon system. Its entire existence narrowed down to the data points flickering on the consoles. The tactical action officer began the final sequence for the Sword of the Fleet defensive protocol. He confirmed that the vertical launch system cells were pressurized and that the thermal batteries of the first 12 missiles were already heating to operational temperature. The ship would use the SM-6 missile, officially known as the Standard Missile 6, a multi-mission interceptor capable of hitting targets at extreme ranges and varying altitudes. Each missile cost over $5 million, a staggering investment of American technology designed specifically for this moment of saturation warfare. The plan was to engage the drones in successive waves, beginning with the furthest contacts to ensure no platform survived to reach the inner defensive layer. The crew was briefed through their headsets in short, clipped sentences. Every sailor from the engine room to the bridge understood that the Iranian swarm was now 15 miles away, closing the gap at nearly 3 kilometers every minute. The tactical map showed the merchant convoy, 3 massive oil tankers, and 2 container ships, positioned 4 miles behind the USS Mason, their crews likely unaware of the invisible wall of steel being erected in front of them. The smell of the ocean, thick and heavy with humidity, drifted through the bridge's ventilation, a sharp contrast to the sterile, electrical scent of the combat center. The destroyer's weapons coordinator verified the status of the 32 SM-6 missiles designated for the opening volley. The Mark 41 vertical launch system, located on the forward deck and the aft superstructure, was the most sophisticated magazine in the world. Its armored hatches were the only thing separating the peaceful night from the roaring fire of a rocket motor. The tactical supervisor reported that the target illumination radars were now pulsing in a high-frequency mode, providing the missiles with the precise guidance needed to find a 3-meter-long drone in the vastness of the dark sky. The environment around the ship felt expectant, as if the air itself was waiting for the first detonation. The stars remained hidden behind the haze, and the only light on the exterior of the USS Mason was the faint, ghostly glow of the sea's bioluminescence, churned up by the ship's propellers. At 2:28 in the morning, the commanding officer placed his thumb on the final authorization button. He did not look at his crew, he looked at the red icons on his screen, each one representing a threat to his ship and the international commerce it was sworn to protect. The transition from monitoring to combat was complete. The order was given to engage. 2:30 in the morning, the Arabian Sea. The Aegis combat system on the USS Mason transitioned into its most aggressive autonomous mode, prioritizing high-speed, multi-target tracking across the entire northern horizon. The ship was no longer acting in isolation. Through the Link 16 tactical data link, the destroyer was sharing every radar return and sensor track with the rest of the carrier strike group and the regional command centers. The electronic picture was perfect, a seamless mesh of data that turned 40 individual threats into a single, manageable defensive problem. The air inside the Combat Information Center was thick with the hum of high-output cooling fans, working to dissipate the immense heat generated by the ship's signal processors. The environment outside remained a featureless expanse of black water and heavy mist, but the digital world inside the hull was glowing with the lethal clarity of a combat-ready machine. The commanding officer supervised the establishment of what the United States Navy calls the defensive bubble. This was a 3-dimensional volume of protected airspace extending 60 miles from the ship's center. Inside this bubble, any unidentified or hostile platform was subject to immediate engagement. The Aegis system was now performing thousands of calculations every millisecond, determining the optimal intercept point for each of the 40 Iranian drones based on their current heading, speed, and altitude. The computer prioritized the sea-skimming targets first, as their proximity to the water's surface made them the most immediate threat to the destroyer and the merchant convoy. The technical coordination required for such an engagement was immense. Each SM-6 missile needed a dedicated data uplink to receive mid-course corrections as it flew toward its target. The ANSPY-6 radar was partitioned, with specific sections of the radar face dedicated to scanning for new threats, while other sections provided the high-intensity illumination required for the final seconds of a missile's flight. The weapons coordinator confirmed that the ship's electrical plant was at maximum output, providing the megawatts of power needed to sustain the massive electronic output. The smell of ozone and the faint, dry scent of heated insulation drifted through the compartments, a physical manifestation of the ship's electronic exertion. The Link 16 network showed that other assets in the region were now slave to the USS Mason's radar picture. A pair of FA-18 fighters, flying a combat air patrol 50 miles to the south, received the target data on their own cockpit displays. While the Mason would be the primary shooter, the fighters stood by to provide cleanup should any of the drones leak through the initial missile screen. This layered defense was the hallmark of American naval doctrine, a redundant and highly professional system designed to ensure that no single point of failure could lead to a successful enemy strike. The crew of the Mason felt the ship heel slightly as the helmsman maintained the optimal orientation for the radar arrays, keeping the incoming swarm directly in the center of the ship's primary field of view. The tactical supervisor reported that the first 12 fire control solutions were locked. The Aegis system had already assigned a specific SM-6 missile to a specific drone, calculating the flight path that would result in a kinetic intercept at a range of approximately 18 miles. The environment in the Combat Information Center was one of quiet, focused intensity. There was no shouting, only the rhythmic clicking of trackballs and the steady, professional reporting of data points. Every sailor knew that the 32 missiles ready in the forward and aft launchers represented the most advanced defensive capability in the world. At 2:34 in the morning, the weapons coordinator reported that the first cell of targets had entered the primary engagement zone. The ship's automated voice system confirmed the status. Batteries released. This was the final mechanical hurdle before the first launch. The USS Mason was now a coiled spring, its sensors locked onto 40 targets, its computers coordinating with the wider fleet, and its missiles ready to reclaim the sky. The salt-heavy air outside the hull was still and dark, a deceptive calm that was about to be broken by the roaring fire of the United States Navy's response. 2:35 in the morning. The forward deck of the USS Mason erupted in a choreographed display of raw kinetic energy. The order had been given, and the ship's tactical computer initiated the firing sequence for the first cell of the Mark 41 vertical launch system. A series of armored hatches on the bow hissed open, and in an instant, the deck was transformed into a landscape of fire and thunder. The first SM-6 missile shrieked off the rail. The solid rocket booster ignited with a deafening roar that vibrated through the steel hull and into the very marrow of the sailors' bones. A brilliant pillar of white-hot flame punched backward into the launch cell, the heat blast washing across the deck and vaporizing the salt spray in a localized cloud of steam. The missile cleared the ship in less than a second, trailing a thick column of white smoke that blotted out the stars. 3 seconds later, another hatch cleared, and a second interceptor accelerated into the night, followed by a third and fourth in rapid, 5-second intervals. The air on the weather decks was suddenly thick with the sharp chemical bite of burning propellant and the iron smell of heated metal. 18 miles away and 3,000 meters above the dark water, the first SM-6 reached its terminal phase. The missile's active radar seeker locked onto the leading Iranian Shahed-136 drone. The interceptor, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, made a final, violent course correction. The warhead, a blast fragmentation sleeve designed to shred aerial targets with thousands of tungsten pellets, detonated exactly 0.5 meters from the drone's fuselage. The result was a catastrophic release of energy. The warhead punched straight through the drone's lightweight composite skin and ignited its 4-cylinder engine and fuel cell. A brilliant orange fireball bleached the black sky white for a fraction of a second as the drone was obliterated, its frame torn into hundreds of burning fragments that were sent flying in every direction. The Iranian swarm, programmed for a coordinated assault, reacted to the first losses with a mechanical, frantic shift in behavior. As the lead elements were vaporized, the remaining 36 drones began to execute pre-programmed evasive maneuvers. The sea skimming group split apart, some diving even closer to the wavetops, while others attempted to climb rapidly to find a gap in the radar coverage. On the USS Mason's radar screens, the tight green cluster shattered into a chaotic swarm of red dots, each one weaving and zigzagging in a desperate attempt to avoid the invisible beams of the ship's illumination radars. Despite the maneuvers, the machines were trapped in a mathematical cage. For every movement they made, the Aegis combat system calculated a dozen countermoves, updating the mid-course guidance of the next wave of missiles already in the air. In the immediate aftermath of the first 4 hits, the sky over the Arabian Sea was no longer empty. Falling debris, still glowing with the heat of the explosions, streaked toward the water like dying stars. The sound of the detonations reached the ship seconds later, a series of sharp, rolling cracks that echoed across the surface of the black glass sea. Dead silence briefly returned to the Combat Information Center. Between launch sequences, broken only by the steady, professional voice of the weapons coordinator reporting, kills 1 through 4 confirmed by radar and thermal imagery. The victory was immediate but incomplete. The sky was still filled with dozens of hostile contacts, and the remaining drones were now accelerating toward the ship's inner defensive zone. The environment on the bridge was a mix of intense heat from the electronics and the cold, salt-laden wind whistling through the superstructure. The USS Mason had drawn first blood, but the engagement was only moving into its most violent phase. The Mark 41 launchers were already cycling for the next salvo, the armored hatches ready to release the next wave of fire. 2:38 in the morning. The Arabian Sea. The second wave of the Iranian swarm, seeing the destruction of their leaders, intensified their assault. 36 drones remained, and they were no longer flying in a passive formation. They had begun their terminal attack runs, their engines screaming at maximum RPM as they dove toward the water. The air over the ocean, previously a still wall of humidity, was now being carved apart by the supersonic wakes of United States Navy interceptors. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason, the temperature seemed to rise as the tactical computers hit peak processing loads, managing dozens of simultaneous intercepts. The smell of ozone was overpowering now, a dry, electric scent that signaled the ship's total commitment to the fight. The Aegis system did not hesitate, as the drones fragmented into smaller cells. To saturate the ship's sensors, the weapons coordinator initiated a rapid-fire sequence. The forward vertical launch cells cycled with mechanical perfection. 8 SM-6 missiles exited the ship in a 10-second burst, a continuous pillar of fire that turned the midnight darkness into artificial day. The roar was constant, a physical pressure that vibrated the deck plates and sent a fine mist of seawater flying off the ship's railings. The missiles climbed vertically before pitching over in a violent arc, their white exhaust trails etching a grid of death across the horizon. 10 miles out, the collision of technologies reached a fever pitch. The SM-6 missiles, guided by the AN/SPY-6 radar, ignored the drone's desperate weaving. One interceptor dove from 20,000 feet. Its seeker locked onto a sea-skimming Shahed drone that was only 20 meters above the waves. The missile slammed into the water just inches from the target, the proximity fuse detonating the warhead, with enough force to create a massive water spout mixed with the shredded remains of the drone. The kinetic energy of the blast wave crushed the light composite frame of the drone instantly, sending it tumbling into the swells as a ball of mangled carbon fiber and burning fuel. The Iranian swarm attempted one final desperate tactic. The remaining 28 drones converged from multiple headings, trying to find the blind spot in the ship's defense by approaching from the stern and the bow simultaneously. But the USS Mason was not alone in the digital architecture of the fleet. The 2 FA-18 fighters from the Carrier Strike Group, now orbiting at 30,000 feet, were directed by the Mason's controllers to intercept the high-altitude elements of the swarm. The fighters rolled into their dives, their own AIM-120 missiles, leaving their wings in streaks of white light. The coordination was seamless. The ship handled the low-altitude threats, while the aircraft cleared the upper tiers. The defenders' reaction was a study in controlled aggression. The USS Mason executed a sharp 10-degree turn to bring its aft Mark 41 launchers into a better firing position. As the ship leaned into the turn, the aft deck erupted with its own volley of missiles. The sailors in the aft steering compartment felt the heat through the overhead, a searing reminder of the power being unleashed just meters above their heads. The environment was a chaotic mix of blinding light and the acrid stink of burnt powder, but the tactical displays showed a systematic thinning of the red icons. The drones were being hunted down. One by one, their primitive guidance systems no match for the multi-billion-dollar network of the United States Navy. The sky was now a graveyard of burning magnesium and jet fuel. Dozens of secondary explosions rippled across the horizon as the drone's own warheads detonated. Upon impact with the interceptors, the sound was a rhythmic staccato of thunder, rolling over the black water in waves. The professional calm in the Combat Information Center held, even as the radar reported that 20 more drones had been successfully neutralized. In under 90 seconds, the shield of the Arabian Sea was proving impenetrable, but the final, most dangerous cluster of the swarm was now only 6 miles away, moving at its highest possible speed, 2:40 in the morning. The inner defensive zone of the USS Mason was no longer a theoretical boundary, it was a wall of fire. The remaining 12 Iranian drones, the survivors of the long-range intercept, had compressed into a final, dense wedge. They were now less than 6 miles from the destroyer, screaming toward the ship at 190 kilometers per hour. The air surrounding the vessel was thick with the gray-white haze of spent missile propellant, smelling of sulfur and burnt electronics. Inside the Combat Information Center, the light from the screens was almost blinding as the Aegis system shifted its entire processing power to the terminal engagement phase. The command was given: all batteries, rapid fire. The Mark 41 vertical launch system on the forward deck responded with a final, violent sequence. 4 SM-6 missiles exited their cells in a single, overlapping roar of white-hot exhaust. The thermal shock was so intense it buckled the paint on the nearest blast deflectors. These missiles did not climb. They pitched over immediately, their rocket motors burning with a fierce, violet-white intensity as they engaged the drones at point-blank range. The shockwaves from the launches rattled the glass in the bridge windows and sent a physical jolt through the boots of every sailor on duty. The collision was absolute and instantaneous. 3 miles out, a cluster of 4 drones was caught in a crossfire of 2 SM-6 missiles. The first interceptor drove into the center of the formation, its warhead detonating with a force that compressed the air into a visible sphere of pressure. The blast wave shredded the leading drone, turning it into a spray of carbon fiber dust before the secondary heat ignited the fuel cells of the 2 adjacent platforms. They erupted into twin orange fireballs that tumbled toward the black water, leaving long, arcing trails of smoke. The fourth drone, its guidance sensors blinded by the flash, veered sharply into the path of the second missile and was obliterated in a direct kinetic impact. The final 3 drones, flying just 10 meters above the wavetops, entered the range of the ship's close-in weapon system, the CIWS. The 20mm Gatling gun on the aft superstructure slewed around with a robotic, high-pitched whine. It opened fire with a sound like a giant piece of canvas being ripped in half. A stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds poured into the dark at a rate of 75 shots per second. The tracers created a solid line of red light reaching out to the horizon. The first drone was sawed in half by the wall of metal, its wings shearing off before the main body disintegrated into a cloud of sparks. The second took a burst directly to its nose, the high-explosive warhead inside the drone detonating prematurely and sending the wreckage cartwheeling across the surface of the sea. The last drone made it to within 1,000 meters. It was close enough for the bridge crew to see the red glow of its exhaust through their night vision optics, but the ship's electronic warfare suite had already locked onto its control frequency. As the CIWS adjusted its aim, the drone's motor suddenly sputtered and died, the jamming signal cutting its internal brain. The aircraft pitched forward, its nose digging into the crest of a 2-meter swell. It did not explode. It simply vanished into the black water with a sharp splash, silenced forever. Dead silence fell over the USS Mason. The roar of the missiles and the scream of the Gatling gun were gone, replaced by the low, distant hum of the ship's engines. The sky, which moments ago had been filled with streaks of fire and the orange glow of dying machines, was black once more. A light wind carried the smell of burnt powder and salt across the deck. The tactical display showed a clean screen, 0 hostile tracks. Every one of the 40 drones had been neutralized. The shield of the Arabian Sea had held. 2:55 in the morning. The Arabian Sea. The tactical displays in the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason were, for the first time in an hour, entirely clear of hostile tracks. The green circles representing the merchant convoy remained steady on their course. 3 miles astern, their crews likely witnessing the spectacular light show but remaining safe behind the destroyer's perimeter. The air inside the ship was still chilled, but the tension had transitioned into a focused, professional assessment phase. Every sailor at a console was now engaged in the systematic process of killing the data, verifying that every red icon that had appeared on the screen was matched by a confirmed physical destruction event. The commanding officer ordered a slow 360-degree scan using the ship's electro-optical sighting system. On the high-resolution infrared monitors, the surface of the Arabian Sea looked like a graveyard of thermal ghosts. Small, glowing hot spots littered the water for miles, each one a piece of an Iranian drone's engine or a fragment of a fuel cell still burning as it floated on the swells. The environment was eerie. The black glass of the water was broken only by these dying embers and the occasional white splash of a larger piece of wreckage finally losing its buoyancy and sinking into the 3,000-meter deep abyss. The smell of the sea, once dominant, was now entirely replaced by the heavy, industrial stench of burnt propellant and vaporized composite materials that hung in the humid air like a fog. The electronic warfare officer reported the final tally: 40 targets engaged, 40 targets neutralized. The ship had expended 32 SM-6 missiles and approximately 200 rounds of 20mm ammunition. From the close-in weapon system, there were 0 misses. The efficiency of the Aegis combat system, paired with the latest block of the Standard missile, had achieved a statistical perfection that would be studied at the Naval War College for years. The technical supervisor began downloading the sensor logs, a massive treasure trove of data that captured every maneuver, every jamming attempt, and every millisecond of the drone's terminal flight paths. The damage assessment team reported that the USS Mason had suffered no physical hits, but the ship's exterior told the story of the intensity of the engagement. The forward vertical launch system deck was blackened, the non-skid coating scorched by the thousands of degrees of heat generated by the rapid-fire missile launches. The white paint on the nearby superstructure was blistered and peeling in places, a testament to the sheer thermal energy released by the solid rocket boosters. Despite the cosmetic damage, the ship remained fully mission-capable. Its primary sensors and weapon systems already reset and searching for a second wave that intelligence suggested might not be coming. The silence on the bridge was broken only by the low, rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the occasional hiss of the radio. The crew's eyes were bloodshot, their movements slow but deliberate, as the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. They had just conducted the largest successful drone swarm interception in naval history, yet there were no cheers, only the quiet, professional satisfaction of a job executed exactly as trained. The Gulf air outside was cooling slightly. As the early morning hours wore on, the salt spray continuing to coat the ship in a layer of fine white dust that mixed with the gray soot of the missiles. The executive officer made a final sweep of the tactical situation. The Iranian coastal radars, located over 200 miles to the north, were still active, but they had ceased their aggressive probing. The message had been sent and received, with the clarity of a kinetic detonation. The merchant vessels, carrying millions of barrels of oil destined for global markets, continued their steady transit, at 16 knots, undisturbed. The USS Mason remained in the center of the Dark Sea, a 10,000-ton sentinel of American power, its crew already beginning the transition back to the long, watchful hours of a combat patrol. 3:30 in the morning, the Arabian Sea. The USS Mason had slowed its speed to 5 knots, its massive hull rolling gently in the 2-meter swells as it began the critical process of intelligence recovery. The engagement was over, but the battle for information was just beginning. In the humid darkness, a specialized team of sailors prepared to launch one of the ship's MH-60 Sierra helicopters. The air on the flight deck carried the sharp, stinging smell of burnt JP-5 aviation fuel and the lingering, acrid scent of the missile launches. The environment was one of high-stakes precision. Every piece of debris recovered from the water could provide the United States Navy with a roadmap into the future of Iranian drone technology. The helicopter lifted off the deck with a rhythmic thrum, its nose dipping as it transitioned into forward flight. Using its advanced multispectral targeting system, the aircrew scanned the surface of the black water for the largest pieces of wreckage. They weren't looking for scrap metal. They were hunting for the brains of the drones, the undetonated guidance computers, the satellite link antennas, and the optical seekers that had survived the mid-air destruction. At latitude 21 degrees 12 minutes north, the helicopter's spotlight cut through the haze, illuminating a large section of a delta wing floating among the white foam of the waves. The recovery was a grueling physical task. A small boat was lowered from the side of the destroyer, carrying a team of technical intelligence specialists. The water was choppy, and the smell of the sea was now mixed with the oily sheen of spilled fuel from the downed drones. The team worked with flashlights and grappling hooks, pulling jagged pieces of carbon fiber and twisted aluminum over the side of the rigid hull inflatable boat. The most significant find was a nearly intact engine and tail section from one of the final drones that had been splashed by the close-in weapon system. This piece of hardware was a goldmine, potentially containing the serial numbers and manufacturing stamps that would prove the direct involvement of the Iranian state. Inside the ship's specialized intelligence compartment, the mood was clinical. As the first pieces of wreckage were brought aboard, technicians began the process of decontaminating the salt-soaked electronics. The goal was to extract the flash memory from the drone's flight control computer. By analyzing the pre-programmed waypoints and the communication logs, the United States Navy could determine exactly where the swarm had been launched and what specific ship tracking algorithms they were using. This was forensic warfare, turning the enemy's weapons into a witness against them. The air in the lab was sterile and quiet, a sharp contrast to the violent thunder of the engagement an hour prior. The initial assessment confirmed a chilling level of sophistication. These drones were not off-the-shelf hobbyist equipment. The wiring was mil-spec, the circuit boards were professionally etched, and the anti-jamming filters on the GPS antennas showed a high level of engineering. The data suggested that the swarm had been receiving real-time updates from a shore-based radar station, allowing them to adjust their flight paths to avoid the ship's initial defensive layers. Every discovery was recorded and transmitted via secure satellite link to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Maryland, providing immediate updates to the global threat database. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, a pale gray line against the black of the eastern sky, the USS Mason finished its recovery operation. The deck was now cluttered with crates of wet, mangled machinery, each one a piece of evidence in a larger geopolitical puzzle. The environment was shifting from the intensity of combat to the heavy, methodical work of documentation. The ship began to accelerate, returning to its station at the head of the merchant convoy. The shield of the Arabian Sea had not just stopped an attack, it had captured the tools of the attacker, ensuring that the next time a swarm appeared, the United States Navy would be even more prepared to erase it from the sky. 7:45 in the morning, the Arabian Sea. The sun was now fully above the horizon, a white-hot disk that turned the humidity into a heavy, shimmering haze. The USS Mason was no longer alone on the open water. To its starboard side, less than 50 meters away, the massive replenishment ship USNS Arctic maintained a steady course. The two vessels locked together in a dangerous, high-speed dance, known as underway replenishment. The environment was a cacophony of industrial sound. The roar of the two ships' wakes colliding, the scream of the heavy-duty winches, and the rhythmic thumping of the massive fuel and supply lines stretching between the hulls. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, salt spray, and the hot, metallic scent of the heavy machinery working at maximum capacity. The primary objective of this evolution was the technical feat of rearming the Mark 41 vertical launch system while at sea. Normally, a destroyer would return to a secure port to crane new missiles into its cells. But the tactical situation in the Arabian Sea demanded that the USS Mason remain on station. This was the Deep Magazine Protocol, a logistics miracle of the United States Navy. High-tension wires, known as the spanning cables, connected the two ships as they moved at 16 knots through a 3-meter swell. Each movement of the ship's hulls had to be compensated for by the winch operators with the precision of a surgeon, as any sudden slack or tension could snap the cables and send thousands of tons of steel into a collision. From the deck of the USNS Arctic, a large specialized canister began its transit across the void. Inside was a fresh SM-6 missile, weighing over 1,500 kilograms. The canister slid along the high line, suspended over the churning white water of the gap between the ships. On the deck of the Mason, a team of 20 sailors, wearing color-coded life vests and helmets, waited to receive the payload. The salt-heavy wind whipped around them, making the task of guiding the massive canister into its vertical cradle an exercise in raw physical strength and extreme focus. The deck of the destroyer heaved and rolled, but the team moved with practiced synchronization, using guide ropes to settle the missile over the open hatch of the launcher. The logistical complexity extended beyond the physical movement of the missiles. Below decks, in the ship's magazines, the ordnance team was working to inventory the remaining interceptors and reset the electronic interlocks for the new arrivals. The technical supervisors were cross-referencing the serial numbers with the Aegis systems database, ensuring that every new SM-6 was handshaking with the ship's fire control computers. The air in these lower compartments was stagnant and hot, filled with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the ozone of the high-voltage testing equipment. Every sailor was pushed to the limit, their uniforms soaked with sweat and stained with the gray grease of the cables. This was the invisible backbone of American naval power. The ability to shoot down 40 drones in a single hour was a feat of engineering, but the ability to replace those 40 missiles in the middle of a contested ocean was a feat of logistics. Without the USNS Arctic and its crew, the USS Mason would be a $10 billion paperweight after its first engagement. Instead, as each new canister was lowered into its cell and the armored hatches were sealed, the destroyer's combat effectiveness was restored. The process was slow and methodical, repeated 32 times as the morning heat intensified, turning the steel decks into frying pans. By 10 in the morning, the final missile was seated, and the power cables were disconnected. The USNS Arctic veered away, its mission complete, leaving the USS Mason once again as the sole guardian of the merchant convoy. The environment returned to the steady, monotonous rhythm of a combat patrol, but the ship was once again a fully loaded predator. The logistics phase was over, the shield was replenished, and the United States Navy had proven that its reach was as long as its supply lines. The following day, the United States Naval Forces Central Command Headquarters in Manama, Bahrain. While the USS Mason continued its patrol, the digital echoes of the engagement were reverberating through the highest levels of global diplomacy and military intelligence. The environment in the command center was one of clinical analysis. The air-conditioned silence broken only by the low murmur of briefing officers and the persistent hum of the server racks. Large screen displays showed the Arabian Sea, now clear of threats, but the geopolitical map was glowing with the heat of the incident. The smell of the facility was one of sterile carpets and fresh coffee, a sharp contrast to the salt and burnt powder that still clung to the hull of the destroyer hundreds of miles to the south. The regional response was immediate and divided. In a coordinated diplomatic offensive, the United States State Department released a detailed report of the engagement backed by the high-resolution infrared footage and recovered telemetry from the Mason sensors. The evidence was irrefutable. 40 platforms had been launched from known Iranian military facilities with the intent to strike international commerce. This transparency was a professional weapon in itself, designed to strip away the deniability that often characterizes swarm warfare. Within hours, key regional partners, including the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, issued statements condemning the provocation and reaffirming their support for the United States-led maritime security missions. In the Iranian capital, the tone was one of defiant silence, followed by a brief, dismissive statement claiming the drones were part of a routine coastal exercise that had strayed into international waters due to navigational errors. However, the technical reality told a different story. The precision with which the drones had converged on the USS Mason proved a level of command and control that was incompatible with an accidental stray. The United States Navy's decision to publish the recovery of the brains of the drones, the intact guidance computers had clearly caught the planners in Tehran off guard. The atmosphere in the diplomatic corridors of the Gulf grew heavy with the realization that the rules of engagement had shifted. The engagement served as a massive validation of American naval doctrine. For years, critics had argued that low-cost drone swarms could render multi-billion-dollar destroyers obsolete through simple attrition. The USS Mason had just proven the opposite. The successful use of the SM-6 missile to achieve a 100% intercept rate sent a clear message to any adversary. The United States Navy's shield was not just a theoretical concept, it was a functioning, lethal reality. Commercial shipping insurance rates, which had spiked in the hours following the first reports of the swarm, began to stabilize as the markets reacted to the demonstration of security. The freedom of navigation, the invisible foundation of the global economy, had been physically defended. In Washington, the Pentagon used the event to brief congressional leaders on the necessity of continued investment in directed energy and advanced interceptors. The USS Mason's engagement was cited as a primary example of high-end gray zone conflict, where the threshold of war is constantly tested but never quite crossed. The professional conduct of the crew was highlighted as the gold standard of modern naval operations: disciplined, proportionate, and devastatingly effective. The environment in the capital was one of sober assessment. While a major conflict had been avoided, the frequency and scale of such provocations were clearly on the rise. As the news cycle moved on to other such providing global crises, the shield of the Arabian Sea remained a focal point for military planners across the globe. The engagement had provided the first real-world data on mass drone saturation tactics versus a modern Aegis-equipped destroyer. The result was a definitive win for the United States, but it was also a warning. The technology of the attacker would continue to evolve, and the defenders in the Arabian Sea would have to remain as sharp as the sensors they operated. The geopolitical fallout was not an end, but a transition into a more complex and dangerous phase of maritime competition. 1200 hours. The Arabian Sea. The USS Mason maintained its steady pace at 16 knots, its bow slicing through the blue-green water as it resumed its position at the head of the merchant convoy. The intense heat of the midday sun had dried the decks, but the salt crust from the night's engagement remained, a fine white powder that coated the sensors and the armored hatches of the vertical launch system. The environment on the bridge was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic clicking of the helmsman's controls and the low-frequency thrum of the ship's electrical systems. The crew had finally rotated through their rest cycles, but the atmosphere remained one of sharp, professional focus. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by the heavy, quiet realization of what they had accomplished. The commanding officer stood on the bridge wing, looking out over the vast expanse of the sea. The horizon was clear, the sky a featureless blue that offered no hint of the fire and debris that had filled it only 36 hours before. The mission continued. The merchant tankers, carrying the lifeblood of the global economy, were still there, their steel hulls reflecting the sunlight as they moved toward the Strait of Hormuz. The success of the mission was measured not in trophies or celebrations, but in the lack of damage to those vessels. The United States Navy had fulfilled its primary mandate to ensure that the sea lanes remained open, regardless of the cost or the complexity of the threat. Inside the ship, the long-term work of maintenance had already begun. Technicians were busy cleaning the salt and soot from the radar arrays, ensuring that the ANSPY-6 remained at peak sensitivity. In the Combat Information Center, the software teams were running diagnostic checks on the Aegis processors, clearing the logs and resetting the engagement parameters for the next watch. The smell of the ship was returning to its baseline recycled air, diesel, and the faint, ever-present scent of the ocean. For the sailors of the USS Mason, the engagement with the 40-drone swarm was now a series of data points in their training records, a story they would tell for the rest of their lives, but a task they were prepared to repeat tomorrow. The impact of the engagement would be felt far beyond this single patrol. The data captured by the Mason sensors was already being integrated into the training simulators at Naval Station Norfolk and San Diego. Every maneuver the Iranian drones had attempted, the sea skimming, the terminal weaving, the saturation of the radar horizon, was being analyzed to make the next generation of American interceptors even more lethal. The Shield of the Arabian Sea was not just a title, it was a living, evolving system of people and technology. The crew had proven that even in the face of a new and unpredictable form of warfare, the fundamental principles of discipline, technical mastery, and decisive action remained the ultimate defense. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the flight deck, the USS Mason turned slightly to the north. The shield was still up. The ship's lights were extinguished as the darkness returned, its presence once again marked only by the silent, invisible energy of its radars searching the void. The Arabian Sea was calm, the water reflecting the first few stars as they appeared through the haze. The conflict had been sharp and violent, but the resolution was a return to the status quo, a peace maintained by the constant, watchful presence of 10,000 tons of American steel. The mission of the United States Navy is often defined by the battles that do not happen, but on this night, it was defined by the one that did. The USS Mason had met the swarm and erased it. The convoy moved on. The sea remained free. The crew of the destroyer took their stations for the night watch, their eyes on the screens, their hands on the controls, waiting for the next time the horizon would try to break the silence.